Hi Booktube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads. Skin Elegies by Olsen. Leeches by Serbian author David Albahari. Translated by Elias Bursak. Curtis White, The Idea of Home. Zadie Smith, short story or novella, The Embassy of Cambodia. And finally, Richard Milward's Man-Eating Typewriter, which is a buddy read with Bob the Bookerer. So I'm going to start with Lance Olsen, Skin Elegies. This is my third Olsen book I've read. And he's very much a writer of fragmentary, polyphonic novels. Sometimes they centre around a specific individual, such as David Bowie, Franz Kafka, Friedrich Nietzsche, or, as in the case of Red Heaven and this, they are genuinely polyphonic. So I suppose the fragmentary sections here reflect the 1999 tsunami and then the Fukuyama nuclear meltdown leak. There's also the last days of the German Reich in Berlin, where a general has managed to smuggle his family into a bunker with him, with the Russians outside. There's the disastrous Challenger explosion off the launch pad. There's a storyline about an ageing American professor who goes to Switzerland for an assisted suicide. So you can see a lot of the themes here around death. And in a way, that is the overarching focus of the book, where it's trying to encapsulate the last seconds of a human mind as it's on the point of extinction. You know, what would that sound like? What would go through what would go through your mind, if you're in the Challenger and the whole thing is about to sort of fall apart and blow up and crash it back onto Earth into the ocean. You've voluntarily given yourself up to death, as in the case of the professor. What are the final thoughts as you're lying there when you press the valve to release the poison that will kill you and things like that. So it's very much trying to capture and encapsulate the human mind, the human brain. And the reason it does that is because actually this is a book about transhumanism. The notion of different theories of how we can, if not achieve immortality, at least significantly extend the human lifespan, which is something my next book is about and shares a lot with this book. Now in this case, it is not looking at physical means of extending the physical life of the body, such as medicine and implants and all this sort of stuff. It's purely looking at the notion of a downloadable human consciousness. And again, it's how do we, not only map the whole neural network of the brain with all its sort of fiendish complexity, but, would it work? Would a bodiless brain, or not a brain, but would a bodiless consciousness be able to function without its body? Because all of our experiences and memories are filtered through the physical environment and our bodies moving through those environments. What would happen to language? So, this is terrific. 5 stars. The guy can't put a foot wrong as far as I'm concerned. Now on to David Albahari's Leeches. So David Albahari was a writer whose name I'd seen bandied about, but I hadn't got around to reading anything of his, and he died a couple of weeks ago, so that sort of brought forward my intention to read him. And he is a Serbian author of Jewish ethnicity, and I think he sort of moved from Serbia to Canada. But as far as I can tell, his books are very much about Serbia and that Balkans region. And this starts off with the protagonist, who is a journalist who writes columns for a still independent Serbian newspaper in an increasingly difficult sort of field of media to operate in, because this is after the Yugoslavian civil war, but now Serbia is turning its attentions to Kosovo. And if you remember your recent history, that led to a bombardment of Serbia, an aerial bombardment of Serbia by NATO. So it's in the lead up to that So the regime is getting more and more repressive, and freedoms are being whisked away. So that's the background for this journalist. And he spies on the bank of the Danube a man slapping a woman, and she stumbles back and her feet go into the sort of the muddy bank of the river. And he's sort of going to go over there and intervene when he sees a third person, part of this triangle, a man in a dark trench coat who looks rather menacing. So he decides that he's going to watch what happens. And all three of these characters go their different ways, and now he's sort of challenged with, well, which one should I follow? So of course he decides he's going to follow the woman, because as with so many books, at the end of the day, the motivation of male protagonists is they want to get their leg over one way or another, even if it's not immediately obvious. Anyway, the one thing that didn't strike him as real is that the slap didn't seem big enough or hard enough to produce the reaction of the woman stumbling backwards, and that's sort of what he wants to quiz her. And this starts a whole series of events and puzzles and clues as to ask a huge question, as is reality, the reality that we experience, is it all connected up? Does everything feed and interconnect with everything else? Or is it completely chaotic and random? And in order to try and solve that puzzle, as he's sort of getting all these clues and codes, are they random, or do they in fact bear deeper hidden meaning? He contacts a mathematician. He gets involved with some Jewish Kabbalists. He takes a lot of pot. Each of these are equally valid means of trying to crack the code, really. And of course they themselves are all interrelated, in that Kabbalah, through the gematria, where the alphabet of the Hebrew language, every letter has a numerical value, so that not only do these sort of arguments have to win you over by the force of their reason, if you knew the maths and if you could do the maths, the equations will balance perfectly as a secondary proof of the sort of infallibility of God's wisdom and all that sort of stuff. So there are all these sort of streams I thought the first half of the book was really good, but then it got a bit too wrapped up in the mysticism and the supernatural, really, of the Kabbalah side of it, for my personal taste. I mean, if you're interested in that, this is definitely, stick with it. I mean, I did stick with it, but I just felt it was a bit too much of that to resolve these ideas and to resolve the plot. So this is a description of a grass high. I sighed, rose with effort, and weaving gently went over to the waste paper basket by my desk. When I knelt down, the entire room knelt with me, and when I bent my head to peer into the basket, I felt my brain touch my forehead on the inside. That was a really good way of describing the physical sensation of being stoned. And another one, this is sort of describing the physical sensation of being in love. I was wondering whether she could feel it in her fingertips, which rested on the table, how my heart was pounding, since I was seated at an angle and the left side of my chest rested against the table's edge. So I just really like those sorts of ideas. I will say that it's also, coming back to that notion of the sort of decreasing environment of freedom in Serbia, that it's about scapegoating Jews and gypsies, and that this sort of Kabbalistic text that's at the heart of this book is really a sort of a manual or a guidebook to Jews to how to basically, shield themselves, how to preserve themselves. And I thought some of those ideas were quite interesting, of the modern of, sort of racism and thuggery and bigotry against this sort of ancient sort of mystical wisdom. But all in all, as I say, I did feel a little nonplussed by the level of the Kabbalah stuff in there, so I gave it 4 stars. On to The Idea of Home by Curtis White. So, I love Curtis White. He's never let me down yet, and I've talked about his fiction. I've never read any of his non-fiction. And this little volume is another sort of great piece of writing. Again, sort of quite fragmentary. My favourite book of his is called Requiem, where there's lots of sort of different stories that sort of come together sort of thematically from the modern to sort of classical composers. It moves across time and stuff. And this, in a way, is a prototype of it, because I think it predates Requiem, that it's notionally an examination of his childhood, the area that he grew up in near San Francisco, but more in the sort of the rural area outside of San Francisco. And there's stuff about sort of Little League baseball and other memories. And then it gets sort of more and more into sort of the Vietnam War, the hippie resistance. The section on the sort of the hippie movement and politics and where it sort of failed, I thought was particularly strong. And then it gets a bit more speculative. It's really hard to describe. Basically, it's just sort of these musings do come together to deliver the idea of home, whatever that means for each and every one of us. I just think Curtis White is he's not a taxing read in terms of his language or his concepts. He's sort of postmodernist, but he's not difficult postmodernism, I feel. And again, the guy can write. So just to give you an example, she sat up, squinting, picked up a bottle of Johnson & Johnson's baby oil and spread it on her belly in a way that never failed to excite Dave. Especially exciting was the little puddle in her navel. He actually thought of it as Narcissus Pond, and once he bent down close enough to see the reflection of one hungry eye in it, violent as a belly dancer's ruby. Then Wanda said, in a way that seemed offhand but was really only banal, "Recently, time has been passing so quickly for me." It wasn't like her to be troubled by such ideas. After all, time's most ferocious implication is death, and Wanda did not often concern herself with death. I just thought there's so much brilliant ideas and symbology in that. Time's most ferocious implication is death, and the idea of that this pool of suntan oil in the belly button. He bends down close enough to see the reflection of one hungry eye in it, violent as a belly dancer's ruby. I just think that's sort of terrific writing. And just another example. When the parents, so this is from the hippie section, when the parents of the 60s generation die, their ageing children will experience a delayed authenticity crisis. For years they have defined themselves against the values of their parents. Now, when they push, there will be nothing to push against. So there you get the idea, not the idea, but you get, why Curtis Wright also writes non-fiction. He has a very analytical mind in terms of social history and cultural history. So terrific stuff, 5 stars. And on to Zadie Smith, The Embassy of Cambodia. I've never particularly been taken by Zadie Smith. I know she's an absolute sort of literary darling. I've just never really sort of found anything in her work. I mean, she grew up in the same area of London that I did. So, I recognise a lot of the cultural landmarks. Maybe that's why. Maybe to me these are not illuminating, because I also lived them. But anyway, so this was the story of a recent immigrant into London. And she's living in the suburbs where she's working as a cleaner for this family. They want her only to clean their house, but the sheer human in her, the human that is struggling to find the humanity of living the life of an immigrant, that when the children get into trouble in this house, the humanity in her means she goes and helps them. If they're injured, she binds their wounds, that kind of thing. And the parents aren't happy about this. They just want her to clean house. And, she has no money because they basically, for her food and keep, that is her payment from this family. So the only outlet she has is to go to church on Sundays, where she meets this Nigerian immigrant man who is a bit of a philosopher. And they have a really sort of fruitful friendship. He pays for everything because she has no money. And her only other indulgence is that the people she works for are members of a health club, and they have lots of guest passes to enable people to accompany them go swimming. So she steals some of these and she goes swimming when the family are out at their family shop. And that's her only other pleasure. And the world sort of collide when she invites the Nigerian to go swimming with her. And this health club is near, surprisingly, the embassy of Cambodia, which is in suburban London, not where they normally are in the centre of London, because of its sort of checkered history with the Khmer Rouge and everything. So that's sort of what the book's about. It's about the emigrant experience, but not entirely satisfactory to my mind. You know, so in case you didn't know, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia were a Maoist year zero, back to the, you know, sort of primitive society, get rid of the modern world, and they moved every single urban citizen out of the cities into the farmland to basically harvest rice, which was an absolute catastrophe, and there were famines and all this sort of stuff, and they closed themselves off completely from the rest of the world, which made it even worse. Anyway, so the people who moved from the cities to the countryside were called the new people, and the peasants who were already there were called the old people, who were felt to be purer and less sullied and stained by foreign ideas and ideologies and things like this. And the protagonist of this book regards herself as a new person because she's in a different country, you know, as an emigrant, and not accepted and looked down upon. And I didn't see that as symmetrical, as a one-to-one correlation. I think that the concept of a new person in Cambodia is not the same as an emigrant in another country, so that really didn't work for me. So anyway, I'm still underwhelmed by Zadie Smith. I can't see myself picking up any of her books. 3 stars. And on to Man-Eating Typewriter by Richard Milward. What a wonderful, exuberant, ebullient read this is. I have to say, it's one of those books where you just read it and enjoy the experience of reading it. You don't think about it too hard. You don't come away with great insights. There are themes, you know, it's about sort of anarchism, it's about terrorism, but it's not really about those things. It's about the 60s and the sort of slowly changing nature of society into a more modern world. It's about the whole sort of 60s swinging London and fashion and stuff, but they're really the backdrop against which this is set. So the main character is a child in France with his mother during the Second World War, which is obviously a terrible time to be caught in France. It's implied but never proved that the mother basically serviced German military officers, and that's how they survived. So they were sort of collaborators. And when they could see the tide of the war was changing, they basically got out of France and relocated to Britain, which was a bombed out, where they found the only sort of surviving house in a street which had been completely abandoned because all the other houses had been demolished. And the mother decides that she and her son are going to sort of cut themselves off from the rest of the world, and she's going to homeschool him, and she homeschools him in anything that was radical bohemian, so Dadaism, surrealism, all this sort of stuff. So he's a very unusual upbringing because he's completely cut off from sort of social relations with people his own age. He never really goes outside the house, so he doesn't really know how to interact. And comes the time when eventually the house finally sort of collapses, falls on the mother and kills her. So he's out of the world on his own with no social skills. And he signs up for the British Merchant Navy, which is where he begins to pick up the language of Polari. Now, Polari, if you don't know, is one of those sort of secret languages known only to those in the know, and it's deliberately so. It's to keep unwanted attention of the authorities away from you. So it's particularly spoken on the high seas, but also amongst the homosexual community, because homosexuality was still illegal at this time. So it's very much the code used, you know, and you have all sorts of other slangs and patois which are doing the same thing, which are sort of maintaining your privacy because those sort of snooping in don't know the language. And it's a wonderfully evocative language that lends itself to this ebullience. You know, in the UK, as I say, it was particularly amongst people in the Navy, but also in Theatreland it was spoken. And Kenneth Williams, who was part of the Carry On film series, is one of the mainstays of it. But it was also hugely influential, popular comedy actor character. He used to do a weekly show, Done, which had a lot of Polari in it. You know, people didn't, you know, in the mainstream didn't know. But they found it funny, and that, you know, helped make, you know, Williams was obviously flamboyantly homosexual, and it made it, you know, helped change the social regard towards homosexuals, and that, you know, helped contribute to the legality of homosexuality. So all of that sort of is sort of bubbling under. But this character, Raymond, is the most unlucky guy. You know, he himself says he's not pretty. When he tries to play pranks on people, they backfire, and he ends up being the victim of them. So, for example, there's a rite undergone whenever you cross the timeline, where you shift from one half of the Earth's hemisphere into the other hemisphere, and it goes disastrously wrong for him, so he's going to get revenge when they go back the other way on his superior officer, but it backfires on him. He ends up in jail, where there's a new revolutionary treatment, which is basically it's called orchidectomy, I think, which is basically remove you the male testicles to make him come more in line. And that's very much, I think, a deliberate nod to Anthony Burgess' A Clockwork Orange, which also has a secret private language there of a teenage gang, where they've made their own language up. And here we have Polari. So I think it's very much acknowledging Burgess's influence there. So when he's released from prison, and they presume that this treatment will work and he'll conform and all that, far from it. He basically sort of gets a load of sex workers from strip clubs and prostitutes to become almost like a cult, and does what his mother did, which is form this community. They want to cut themselves off from the rest of the world. He's sort of indoctrinating them. And he's basically an anarchist. He's anti-authoritarian. But at the heart of it is he wants to get his leg over, just like I said in my review of the Albahari. And as I said, I've read several books, so that's the main motivating factor. But he's very ugly, he has no testicles, so it's really difficult for him to do so. And even his own sort of cult members, who are all sex workers, but they sort of reject his manoeuvres on them in the main. That's the story, and we learn the story of his life because the book starts with a small independent pulp fiction publisher who basically produce smutty books that they sort of disguise as literature, but are really just sort of, you know, for male readers to get their rocks off. They receive a letter from Raymond saying, in X amount of days, I can't remember exactly how many, I'm going to do this sort of humongous crime that will blaze my name across the world. And you will have an exclusive on my life. Every week I will send you the next chapter of my memoir for you to publish, to time, you know, to sort of time when I do this act. You can bring the book out, and, you know, my life will be, everyone will want to read about the life of this terrible criminal personage. And so the editorial team are gaining information about his life at the same rate as we are, because they're only being sent a chapter a week, which is really an ingenious narrative device, I think. And what's so good about this book is we also get insights into the lives of the editorial team. They're very much a down-at-heel publishing group, but we find out about their lives and how this manuscript impacts on their lives. So one of the members is a closet gay, but he can speak Polari, so that's how they can interpret this text. He goes missing. The woman who has to do with all the complaints that their sort of smutty books get, she goes missing. All sorts of things happen to this publishing house, which they think is tied in with this manuscript that they're receiving, but they can't work out how. And they decide that they're going to try and track him down with the moral choice of, do they prevent him from doing this gross criminal act? In which case they won't have a book to publish. Well, they'll still have the book to publish, but no one will care because it's not tied to this infamous character like Charles Manson, for example. Or do they let him go ahead, profit from it, but somehow have to defend accusations that they were in on it, that they knew about it ahead of time, therefore why didn't they report it? So there's a really sort of strong moral dilemma at the heart of it. And Greg, you know, it's been very knockabout, it's been very funny, you know, everything he does turns to, you know, shit, basically. Sometimes you feel really sorry for him, and then all of a sudden, you know, you're under the impression that this guy can't pull off this crime. He's too much of a klutz, you know, nothing ever goes right for him. Then about sort of 2/3 of the way through, it switches and it gets really dark and really impressive, and the crime itself is just... It's not a global crime like 9/11 was, but it's still shocking in itself. It's in the context of this book. I don't think it'd be terribly shocking in the news that we have today, but in the context of this book, you're not expecting it. So I just thought this was terrifically delivered. I give it 4.5 stars, round down to 4, because, as I say, I didn't come away with it anything other than that was a jolly good read. But it's really entertaining. I can recommend it for that. Actually, it'd probably be a good sort of, I know we're late August now, but it'd probably be a good summer poolside read. Although if this was on your deck chair and someone picked it up and leafed through it, they'd probably be pretty appalled if they could penetrate the Polaria. But just to say, just like Burgess's book, you do pick up the language pretty quickly. It's not taxing, it's not that difficult. And there's also, I think, a nod to William Burroughs here. There's a, you know, part of his life is in Tangier, which is referred to as the Interzone, which is what Burroughs called it. So yeah, all in all, I think I can recommend this. I enjoyed it, but I'm not sure how long it's going to stay with me, other than it sort of make me titter whenever I think about it, because it was such a great reading experience. So there you have it. That was my Friday reads. Till next time, thanks very much.